I'm Jennifer Goessens. I'm a legal expert for the Belgian Ministry of Economic Affairs, and I follow up on trust services. And so in this case, I also followed up on the eIDAS revision. I am also one of the experts in Christian's CENTEC 468 Workgroup 1. So I'm going to start just with presenting the current eIDAS framework, so eIDAS 1. Further on, I'm gonna explain to you what the changes are that we can expect for electronic archiving in eIDAS 2, and I will shortly give a heads up on what's going to happen on the political front. So the first eIDAS, eIDAS 1, was adopted in 2014, and it was a very important step in providing a predictable regulatory environment for secure electronic transactions between businesses, but also governments and citizens. And the eIDAS regulation has three main objectives. The firstly is to remove technical and legal obstacles for the operation of the internal market. The second one is to increase confidence in electronic transactions, particularly cross-border, by also ensuring a high level of security and better information, so by operating via a trusted list and trust marks and everything. And lastly, it was to strengthen legal certainty when using electronic means of identification and also trust services. And so there we work on European harmonization, mutual recognition, but also for qualified services, there are assimilation clauses and presumptions for the trust services. So eIDAS 1 has provisions on electronic identification and 5 trust services. So electronic signature, seal, timestamp, registered delivery, and the website authentication services. Now, we are here talking about eArchiving. You can see it's not one of those services that was already included in eIDAS 1. And there was a feeling among experts that it was a gap because you did not go full circle for electronic documents from conception to be able to sending it. But what happens afterwards? Like, how do you archive it? How do you preserve it? And so that is what is going to change in the future with eIDAS 2. So that's good news. What was in eIDAS 1 was an Article 34 that spoke about the preservation service for electronic signatures. And that is often recited or used as an embryo for electronic archiving services. And it does have a preservation purpose, but it does not go as far as an electronic archiving service would, as it is foreseen for eIDAS 2. So what is a qualified preservation service for the electronic signatures? Well, first, it is a service offered by a qualified trust service provider. And that service provider uses procedures and technologies capable of extending trustworthiness of qualified electronic signatures beyond the technical validity period. And it is valid for as well the preservation of the signature as the content within the signature container. There is also an Article 40 that has the same legal effect for seals. Now, what can we expect in eIDAS 2? I would like to start by making some general remarks about eIDAS. So the first one is eIDAS. The eIDAS regulation is a toolbox. That means that there is no legal obligation for users or trust service providers to offer certain services that are described in the eIDAS regulation. During negotiations, we had very worried sounds from National Archives saying, but we have a specific way of how we work, and are we now all going to become trust service providers, yes or no? Well, I can assure you, so eIDAS, it does not impose an obligation to become a trust service provider or to offer a trust service or even more a qualified trust service. So you will not be obligated to step into that system, but you can. So the eIDAS regulation also, it describes more functional requirements. So there will be a very important role for the Commission when it drafts its implementing acts, standardization bodies, and also fora like these ones to guide people and stakeholders throughout this transition of becoming maybe or using an electronic archiving service in the sense of eIDAS. As I just said in my first remark, we have the concerns of national archives were heard, so there is a possible exception for closed systems and national archives. Now, the Commission launched its first proposal for eIDAS 2 in June 2021, and as you can see, that was the text that was published. Just one small article, rather concise, not very detailed, and it was also missing some coherence with how other trust services were explained in the eIDAS regulation. And so member states worked very hard in council work parties to elaborate on that text. And the general approach that was agreed upon contains two recitals that clearly explain scope and purpose of the electronic archiving service. There is a clear definition of what is an electronic archiving service. Christian also mentioned it. It is very hard to agree on a common definition. Should we use the term preservation? Should we use the term archiving? And by including a clear definition of what is an electronic archiving service in eIDAS, we hope that some of the works that go on in other bodies will be facilitated by having this common definition. And there is also two articles that will talk about electronic archiving service that are more detailed and also more structured as the other trust services. We speak about legal effect. What legal effect does the use of an electronic archiving service entail? There is a clear distinction between qualified and non-qualified services. We talk about mutual recognition and everything. And then, of course, once the eIDAS 2 has entered into force, it will be up to the Commission to draft their implementing acts to help with more technical aspects, and so that the functional requirements that are in the regulation text can be translated into technical aids for the sector. So, just on scope, so how do you have to see, or which data or documents fall into the scope of an electronic archiving service in the sense of eIDAS 2? Well, it's all electronic data and electronic documents. And here's, for instance, where electronic archiving differs from Article 34, is like electronic documents, one, you have to see them very broadly. It's like your Word document, your PDF document, but it's also audio-visual content. And it's not just electronically born documents, it's also the digitized documents. So even paper-borne documents that have been digitized fall under the electronic document scope for eIDAS archiving service. Now, what is the purpose of including the eArchiving service in eIDAS 2? It's to guarantee integrity, legibility, and proof of origin of the archived data, and also to provide legal certainty. As mentioned before, there is this exclusion for internal archives that is included also in the recitals. Now, what is the definition that is proposed for an electronic archiving service? It is a service that will ensure reception, preservation, retrieval, and deletion of electronic data. And the key functions of the service will be to guarantee durability and legibility of the archived data, as well as preserve its integrity, the confidentiality, and the proof of origin. Now, as for the legal effect, because the eIDAS eArchiving service has also taken into account, like there's a whole lot of documents that we have to preserve or archive that have a legal value. So we're gonna have to put a legal effect to the data that is put into an archival system. Now, for non-qualified archival services in eIDAS, there is a non-discrimination clause. So the documents or the data that is archived in an electronic archiving service shall not be denied legal effect. That means that in case of a dispute, you present your data that's been archived electronically, a judge cannot just set it aside. However, if you use a non-qualified service, it will be the judge that will decide on the legal value of the data that you present. If you use a qualified electronic archiving service, there is a presumption of integrity and the origin of archived electronic data for the duration of the preservation period. That means that if you can prove that you have used a qualified electronic archiving service, a judge will have to accept the integrity and the origin of the data that you present as evidence. There is also a clause on mutual recognition for qualified electronic archives. That means that a qualified electronic archive that has reached its qualified status, for instance, in Belgium, has to be recognized in the other member states as being a qualified electronic archive. And that is a very big step forward into harmonizing electronic archiving services throughout the Union. Now, what are the requirements for qualified electronic archiving services? Well, firstly, they have to be offered by a qualified trust service provider. And that service provider has to use procedures and technologies to extend durability and legibility of the electronic data beyond technological validity, and at least throughout legal or contractual preservation period, while also maintaining the integrity and the origin. The trust service provider also has to build in safeguards against loss and alteration of the data that is in the qualified electronic archive. Now, what's happened next? That is very interesting to know. So a preliminary agreement was reached between Council, Commission, and Parliament in June 2023. Now, electronic archiving wasn't the only service that was new to the eIDAS regulation. There is also the European Identity Wallet that was introduced, ledgers and everything. So the preliminary agreement that was reached had some gaps. It left many open issues, not really relating to electronic archiving, but to other issues. And so the Spanish presidency had to work very hard, and is still working very hard, to reach a full agreement on the text before the end of their term. And the hallway sounds are really good. So within Council, member states are trying to give their agreement to the final text. Parliament will do the same. And then at the beginning of November, a political trilogue is expected where an agreement will be knocked off. And so we will have eIDAS number 2. And then once there is the entry into force of eIDAS, the Commission will start its work by drafting the implementing acts. So what are the takeaways of my presentation? We will finally have an e-archiving service as a full trust service within the eIDAS regulation. And if you're wondering why you should use an electronic archive or a qualified electronic archive in the sense of eIDAS 2, much will depend on some of the following points. It's like, is there a legal obligation to archive? Then it would be very wise to use a qualified electronic archive in the sense of eIDAS 2. Even if there is no legal obligation to archive, are there other legal or administrative purposes where the security that is offered by a qualified electronic archive can be useful? Or even for general societal, historical, or scientific interests, it could be interesting to use those qualified services because they offer this high level of security and the legal effect that they will have.